Hey y'all, Boogie here, how's it going? And welcome to episode 2 of the classic horror movie mini-arc. Yes, we're doing another mini-arc. I know it's been about a month since I've recorded my last review, and probably about 2 weeks since I should have recorded this review, and I really do apologize. Past couple weeks have been a little bit wonky, to say the least. However, when I was watching this particular film with my Critics Couch other half, Kawawa, he suggested this would be a very good entry to the Sonic Boogie project, and I really do agree with him because this movie is very well done, very well executed, but sadly has only flown below the radar, which you will find out the reasons why in about a few minutes. But really do think this has withstood the test of time, much like Night of the Living Dead was, and that, of course, is the one and only movie Nosferatu. Not really sure why I said that with an Italian accent, I apologize. Now, Nosferatu was a 1922 silent film era German movie directed by Friedrich Murnau, and of course was loosely adapted by the classic book Bram Stoker's Dracula. It was later released in 1928 for an English version into the United States, and since then has slowly built up quite the cult following. Now, I actually saw this movie originally about 20 years ago in my German class back in high school. So it's kind of cool the fact that I saw the German version many years ago, and then a couple weeks ago watched the English adaptation with Kawawa. So both movies are kind of fresh in my brain, so I think it's a great idea to talk about those and touch upon why I think it's withstood the test of time. Now, of course, being the fact that this is a silent film, there really isn't too much that I can discuss and go into detail on from the film perspective itself, but at the same time, those brief details which I'm going to talk about, I think are fantastically done and very well done, particularly since this was something that came out almost 100 years ago. And since so many other horror movies have come out since then, it's a great idea to compare it to other good baselines like Night of the Living Dead, and maybe some more recent ones like, well, my favorite horror movie ever, Suspiria. But before I get into those, the one thing I do want to talk about, which is always the form of discussion with this particular movie, is the comparisons between Bram Stoker's Dracula and Nosferatu itself. Now, just to kind of go as a quick background, of course, while most of my reviews are spoiler heavy, I try and do the spoilers at the end of this review. This entire review will be nothing but spoilers, so if you want to see this movie for yourself, I do highly recommend it. It is available on YouTube and on Amazon. I think Kawawa, I forget where he watched it from, but he definitely saw it on one of the platforms. So it is readily available for watching. So if you are a horror movie buff in general, doesn't matter if you're atmospheric horror, monster horror, gore fest, standard jump scare horror, this is a movie to set the baseline. I really do recommend it. It's not that long, so blow an hour and a half, 2 hours, and check it out for yourself. Now, as I've said, this movie was extremely loosely adapted from Bram Stoker's original Dracula, mainly because of the characters and a couple of the central plot points. Now, of course, it holds true to the central concept of Dracula and the vampires and the characters like the Harkers and Renfield and Van Helsing and things like that, but that is very loosely intertwined, and in some cases it's extremely different from the novel itself. Now, having read Bram Stoker's Dracula many years ago, seen Nosferatu, seen several different forms of the movie Dracula adaptations, I think this movie, aside from the Coppola remake, I think this is one of the few that really holds true to the Dracula message. Now, when I say there's sort of character loosely adaptations, I'm mainly talking about the names. You have the central characters, Jonathan and Mina Harker. However, in Nosferatu, they are known as Thomas, I think his name was, and Ellen Hutter. Instead of Renfield, Harker's boss, you have a gentleman by the name of Knock. And then there's not even a Dr. Van Helsing per se in the movie. There is a village doctor. However, he does not go by the name Van Helsing, and he is not as much of a critical role as Van Helsing is in the book. Now, while these things may seem very imperative to continuing the plot points for it, in Nosferatu, despite having name changes, it still holds true to the central message. You still have Harker, who is the go-getter, the grim realization of what's going on. You do have Renfield as the quirky, uh-oh, there goes Earl acting up again, kind of boss. You have the Van Helsing doctor, who is trying to figure out what's going on with the vampires. But of course, all these things don't compare to the biggest change. As opposed to Count Dracula, like in the Bram Stoker novel, the Dracula in the movie is called Count Orlok, and was acted by portrayed by the late Max Schreck, who for all intents and purposes was kind of the Boris Karloff of his time. But even with these changes, which might seem quite niggling to some people, it's still very well done and still holds true to the central concept, and I think that is something very good. If you take a movie in general, or excuse me, a book in general, and you do a film adaptation to it, there of course are going to be changes to it, whether it's the Coppola remake of Bram Stoker's Dracula, whether it's the movie adaptation to Silence of the Lambs, whether it is Hellraiser compared to the graphic novel Hellbound Heart. There is, of course, always going to be changes to the plot, to the characters, to the setting, anything like that. But as long as it holds true, in my opinion, to the central concept and the central message that the book is trying to portray, mission friggin' accomplished, and this movie does it so well. But I think, despite these things, the biggest elephant in the room, as I keep saying, compared to Dracula and Nosferatu, is the use of the word vampire. The word vampire in Nosferatu, much like how the word zombie in Night of the Living Dead, it was never actually uttered from character to character, or I guess you'd say from text to text to text, since it was, once again, silent film. If you have Harker talking to, or excuse me, see, even I want to talk about it like the book. If you have Hutter talking to Ellen, or Hutter talking to Knock, they never actually utter the word vampire to each other. There is a book called Des Vampires that was touched upon by Hutter and by Ellen, his wife, but once again, the only word they use for vampire in the movie itself is the word Nosferatu, whereas in Bram Stoker's book, of course, that is the central word, vampire, to describe Dracula, to describe the outbreak. And further with that, to go back into Dracula itself, in Bram Stoker's book, Dracula has the ability to create more vampires by biting the necks of the victims and sucking their blood, as is tradition among the mythos, whereas in Nosferatu, Orlok was only killing his victims by sucking the blood out of them. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, that is a lot of differences. That is extremely different from Bram Stoker. So why can you call this a faithful adaptation? Once again, you have to go into this with a different mindset, much like with any film adaptation to a book. And as a voracious reader, if you saw my bookshelf over there, I do have a lot of classic books, and I have seen a lot of classic horror movies. And once again, that's not to brag about what I've done or what I've seen. That is merely suggesting that do go into this and see this for itself as a movie that is about, very similar to the central mythos of Dracula. And if you do that, you will come away with seeing how well done of a movie this is. And of course, my descriptions will never do any kind of movie justice, but by voicing my opinion, you should go out and check this out for yourself. So despite these things, let's actually talk about what I really liked about this particular movie. Your eyes should not glaze over just because I say it's a silent film, because everything that goes into it was very excellently done. And with that being said, let's start with the camera angles. Now, pay in mind, since this was originally released in 1922, it was filmed in 1920 and 1921. And you do have some superb camera angles. It wasn't just still shots. I mean, you had something, there was one scene where the camera angle is zooming over the characters from a vertical position, very reminiscent of Argento's Suspiria, which, you know me at this point, I have talked about this movie as one of my favorite horror flicks. So you do have camera angles and cinematography that was very advanced for that time frame. I mean, yes, you did, of course, have the black and white, and you did have the paneling around it, but I mean, you have steady cams, or whatever was for that time frame, following Hutter on horseback. You do have angles of him walking along, and you do have a smooth camera movement. You do have extreme close-ups and regular close-ups and back and forths of, say, Hutter interacting with the innkeeper, or of Hutter having a very disturbing conversation with Knock, or even him swinging Ellen around in circles, or anything like that, or other interactions. It is very well done because in a silent film with no character dialogue or with no kind of sound effects to that except for the background music, which I will go into, you do have to compensate for that. And I think this was probably ahead of its time. And even still today, if you look at modern horror movies, which of course you know I'm very quick to critique as opposed to classics, I would think this is superbly done. I think if this was a modern-day horror movie, it would definitely be on par with, say, Argento, or maybe even some of Clive Barker's 80s, 90s hits. That's the kind of mindset that I'm thinking. Or even, God forbid, old Eric Kripke like Supernatural, when Supernatural actually was kind of jarring in some cases. And you can call me a wuss if you want to with that. So I want you to take that in consideration, is the camera angles were very well done. And of course, to compensate, the characters do have to interact with each other on a different plane because it's silent and you can't hear what they're talking about. So I want you to take into a moment, think about Harker as he was portrayed in the Dracula movies, or if you've read the Dracula book, about how he was described as kind of starting as the bumbling, naive go-getter, and then coming across the grim realization after his interactions. That is portrayed 1,000-fold, and then you have the descriptions in the text describing Hutter and how he came to where he needed to be, to who he interacted with, to the grim realization of who Orlok was, to him trying to save Ellen, and so on and so forth. That is portrayed not just, once again, in the text, but how his visuals are done, how he comes to that realization, how he there's this look in one scene when he realizes who Orlok is. He's like, oh my God, what have I put my foot in? Or you have Knock as Renfield, as the slowly developing manic servant that is Orlok / Dracula, to how he is portrayed in the books and the movies as this kind of psychotic, insane person. It's very well done, down to the facial descriptions, down to the wiry white hair, almost like Christopher Lloyd was in the old Back to the Future movies, to when he escapes, to when he is leading the townsfolk on the run. Once again, comparisons between everything is extremely well done. Yes, there is some over-dramatization of the characters to some of the townspeople, but once again, in the 1920s, you don't really have, or not the 1920s, you don't really have that luxury to train some of these actors and actresses. Not everybody can be Max Schreck. Not everybody can be the late Paul Newman, even though he was never born in that era. Not everybody can be this all-star actor or actress, so you have to make do with what you have. So, having taken that, and then even so, the biggest thing that set the stage, of course, being a silent era movie, was the music. The organist was fantastic. I think they did a perfect job matching up with the character expressions, matching up with the cinematography, matching up with the darkness and the light scheme that only black and white can really be done, as opposed to color films. To the facial portrayals, I mean, you have the titular Count Orlok, climbing up the stairs that you've seen in every single horror movie. You know what I'm talking about. The shadow of him on the wall with just his long, grubby fingernails coming out, and then you have the camera angle of that with just his shadow, and you have the slow build-up of the organ, and you have this sense of dread creeping across your skin. I mean, even though you know what's going to happen, you can't help but think, oh my God. I mean, it got under my skin several times with the organ and whatnot. And even from the beginning, when you have the credit scene, you're almost immediately thrust into the sense of dread and foreboding. Even in the beginning, when they're introducing Hutter and his wife Ellen and the entire fictional village of Wiesborg, you can't help but think to yourself all this. And when you combine the cinematography, like The Shadow, with Knock interacting as he did, when Orlok is interacting with as he did, with the angles, with the music, with everything like that, and the text describing what's happening. You have the perfect visual novel for what is being portrayed that I think movies like the Coppola remake of Dracula could not accomplish, even though that was fantastically done. That is what this all comes down to, brass tacks. While everything works individually well, when you combine everything into one entity, that is what makes Nosferatu such a cult classic that has withstood the test of time. Because you can't just take one thing by itself. Because that's what silent film eras do. You have to use your imagination, much like an H.P. Lovecraft story. Because, for example, Lovecraft only takes enough for your mind to come up with the overall concept, and you have to fill in the gaps. So you put yourself in that perspective as Hutter, or as the creepy Orlok vampire, or as Ellen, or as Knock, or as the village doctor. And you see it from their eyes, and that's what it did to me. So, with that being said, of course, we have to talk about the plot in a nutshell, and I think this is kind of going to be what cements it for the comparisons and contrast and everything like that. So, once again, this took place in the fictional village of Wiesborg, which is supposed to be an amalgamation of, I'm going to screw these up, Wismar and Lübeck, which are actual German cities. And of course, my friends in Germany, i.e. Morges and Very Grave, will, actually, me if this is incorrect. And you have Hutter, aka Harker, being told by Knox/Renfield there is a piece of property in the Carpathian Mountains where you have to meet with the elusive Count Orlok and see about getting some residence here. So, of course, Hutter travels to the Carpathians and runs into a village where he finds out, you should not be doing this. The village people, the innkeeper, keeps saying you should not go visit Orlok. Excuse me. But, nevertheless, Hutter still does. Even though along the way he picks up a book called Des Vampires. Once again, that's the only time you'll see the word vampire in the course of this movie since, once again, Nosferatu. He arrives and meets this very strange Orlok with his kind of almost elfish, orcish ears and his only two vampire fangs which stick out kind of like walrus tusks as opposed to the usual canines that you might see in other vampire films. They talk about the proper together. Orlok definitely thinks this is going to be something good. And then Hutter cuts himself. And that's when you first kind of find out something is very wrong because Orlok is fascinated by the blood coming from Hutter's hand and tries to bite him. Later on in the course of the movie, as they're getting ready to move, Hutter, of course, is more and more disturbed by Orlok's mannerisms and realizes that in accordance with the Des Vampires book, there's a chance that he is, in fact, Nosferatu. But however, he gets hypnotized, falls asleep, and Orlok tries to kill him by, of course, the biting of the neck. Of course, during the course of this feeding, Ellen, back in Wiesborg, kind of in a trance, basically calls out Hutter's name, and Orlok immediately stops. Now, Hutter does eventually escape from Orlok, but falls out of the castle and passes out. And during the course of this time, Orlok transfers his coffins filled with native dirt. That's another piece, is the lore involved, which differs from the book itself. And Kowo was actually kind enough to remind me of this the other day when we were talking about this review, is that the coffins have to be filled with native dirt for Orlok to survive. So, Orlok is going downriver and the sea to go back from his castle to the house in Wiesborg, where, his words not mine, they can be neighbors. Once again, setting the ambience is very creepy. But Hutter basically gets nursed back to health, and over the course of this time, Orlok brings with him a plague of rats. And one of the other famous scenes, as I'm talking about this, as while people are trying to scramble from the rats and the incoming plague, of course, allusion to the bubonic plague, there is another titular scene of Orlok carrying his coffin down the street in broad daylight. You've seen the pictures of that. That's the second famous picture, alongside the creepy up the stairs thing, to his castle, or to his new house. But Hutter somehow gets back to Wiesborg, despite the wounds on his neck, after he is nursed back to health by whoever the mystery doctors and nurses are, and gets home. And then the whole course of this time, Ellen is kind of in this trance, like she keeps trying to call out, and the more and more this is happening, you see Orlok's grim fascination with Ellen turning into obsession, which could be alluded to Mina and Dracula's love for each other, but it's never touched upon. But once again, very well executed. But Mina kind of realizes after she's read Des Vampires that, okay, yes, Orlok is indeed a Nosferatu, and he's brought with him this mystery plague because of his need to suck blood and to kill the victims, which can only be alluded to, or which can only be, I guess, accusing the rats of them. They're kind of the scapegoat of it. But long story short, she finds out a way to, as long as the the Nosferatu is kept till after sunrise and the cock crows 3 times, which could probably only be an allusion to Jesus and when Peter denied 3 times. Once again, I'm grasping at straws here. It's been a couple of weeks since I've seen the movie, but he does suck her blood. She does die from her wounds, but she does manage to keep Orlok until sunrise, and he dies in a puff of smoke. And then that's pretty much the end of it. It's brief, it's to the point, but these movies don't require a lot of special effects or anything like that. It uses the mind and the human memory to come up with everything, to see that. And that's once again, why I like this movie so much. And I do encourage y'all to go check it out. If you're a horror movie, I mean, even if you're not a horror movie buff, just take a look. It's only like 90 minutes or something like that. It's worth your time. But those are only my opinions, and I really do pass the question off to y'all. If you've seen Nosferatu, what do you like about it? What don't you like about it? Always let me know what you think about it. But once again, I leave that to y'all. So with that being said, before I call it a day, if you like the Sonic Boogie project and you want to check out more of what I do have a Twitter page as well as a public Discord channel, and links to both of those are in the description below, as well as a link to my Twitch page where I do live streams, and if you have some money to get rid of without burning it, Patreon as well. But otherwise, with that being said, y'all have a fantastic day, and I'll catch you in the flip side, alright? Peace.